disciples of all nations. As we seek to put feet to our faith, this is a chapter in the greatest century of missions. The 19th century, and we need to emphasize, some people get confused, that's from 1801 to 1900, was the greatest century of missions. If we want the 21st century to be the greatest century of missions and revival, we need to learn from the Christian pioneers whom God used to make the 19th century the greatest century of Christian advance so far. In 1801, Protestant Christianity was concentrated in Europe and North America. Except for some small Christian enclaves, Asia was almost untouched by the gospel. There were significant Christian communities in Egypt and in Sudan and also Abyssinia, what today is called Ethiopia. And of course, there's a small number of Dutch Christian settlers at the southernmost tip of Africa where we are, Cape of Good Hope. But otherwise, Africa was unevangelized. However, by the end of the 1800s, Christianity was a world religion, with churches established in almost every country on earth. How Christianity became the first truly international religion in just one century is an amazing story. And what inspired these incredibly effective missionary pioneers and the successful strategies that they used needs to be prayerfully examined if we are to be more effective in world evangelization. While the 20th century can boast greater numbers of missionaries in the field and greater numbers of converts, the 19th century saw far greater depth of impact for the gospel, especially when you consider the very limited resources that they had available and the overwhelming difficulties and dangers and the obstacles which they had to overcome. The missionary pioneers of the 19th century clearly present the most inspiring examples of Christian courage and perseverance against all odds. The incredible adventures of these soul winners, these nation builders, these culture shapers, makes for exhilarating reading. The exploits, the achievements of these extraordinary Christian heroes and heroines have been mostly forgotten in the countries where they were sent out from. And for this reason, it's perhaps appropriate that this book, celebrating some of the achievements and adventures and sacrifices of these missionary pioneers, comes from Africa. Because it's we in Africa who have benefited so greatly from the 19th century missionary movement. In this time of secularism and skepticism, some may be surprised to hear how these missionary pioneers are still honored in Africa. Dr. David Livingstone, for example, has 2 towns in Africa named after him, Livingstone in Zambia and Livingstonia in Malawi. And other towns in Africa which were named after Europeans, such as Stanleyville, Salisbury, Elizabethville, Fort Victoria, they've had their names changed. But Livingstone and Livingstonia remain as a tribute to a man who brought faith to the hearts of the Africans, strong, substantial faith. And he struck fear in the hearts of the slave traders. Livingstone is known as a liberator in Africa, as seen here by the stained glass window at the church in Livingstonia, northern Malawi. While statues of many colonial figures like Cecil John Rhodes have been toppled and removed, statues and monuments to missionary pioneers like Dr. David Livingstone retain their prominence and reflect the deep respect which Africans still have for these Christian pioneers. Now, there have, of course, been many concerted attempts to discredit the memory of the early missionaries. Karl Marx declared, "The first battlefield is a rewriting of history." From the time I was first converted to Christ in 1977, I've heard the most vicious slanders against the 19th century missionary movement. At one of the first missions conferences I ever attended up in Rustenburg, a missiology professor, Jimmy Nico Smith from Stellenbosch University, declared, "The missionaries did not believe that black people had souls. They taught that the Africans were the firewood of hell." Now, at the time, I was a new convert. I didn't know very much about anything. But what he said sounded so outrageous, so self-contradictory, they actually stood up in a plenary session of this missions conference and challenged him. "Which missionaries taught this?" I asked. "Did David Livingstone or Robert Moffat teach us?" Nico Smith looked a little surprised, said, "No, not them." "Did C.T. Studd teach these things? Did Mary Slessor believe these things?" And he began to look uncomfortable. "No, not them." "Well, which missionaries believed and taught this house? Because I don't understand why anyone would have come to Africa to be a missionary, many of them dying of diseases here in the field, if they didn't believe the people in Africa were souls for whom Christ died." Didn't many of the missionaries die bringing the gospel to Africa? Why would they have done that? Nico Smith never answered my questions. He drifted off on some anecdotes about some heartless church members that he knew in Pretoria who had bad relations with people of other races. I wondered, what on earth does this have to do with the missionaries of the 19th century, who opened up Africa for the gospel, often at the cost of their own lives? Although I didn't know much about God's law at the time, I had the uncomfortable feeling I'd just heard somebody bearing false witness about Christians of another era, who were not present to be able to answer this slander. It seems very cowardly to make a football out of your spiritual forefathers. And it's easy to score goals if the other team's not on the field. I've always been interested in history, and when I was converted to Christ in 1977, I was overwhelmed with the conviction I was called to missions. The very night I was converted, I knew I was called. So the last over 40 years, I've never doubted that call. I've always been something of a bookworm, so naturally gravitated towards history books. And as my knowledge of missionary history increased, I was astounded at the general ignorance in the church concerning our heritage. I've also been most disappointed at the tendency of many speakers at missions conferences to disparage the missionary pioneers who laid the foundation for the church in Africa, including Cape Town 2010, the largest missions conference in the world. There were still those kind of dumb comments being made. Now, I couldn't help wondering if these speakers really thought that we could have done a better job. You know, like quartermaster, what do you call it, armchair quarterbacks, these people sitting at home with a beer in their hand, criticizing the players in the field. They could have done so much better than the Springboks. I mean, if only they were in the field, they wouldn't have missed that ball, they wouldn't have failed to score that goal and so on. And you just have all these critics, you know, they're lying on the sofa back home, and one hand in a popcorn, the other one holding their can of beer or Coke or whatever, or I suppose now it's Monster energy drinks, and complaining about what the guy in the field's doing. With the few resources they had, facing the overwhelming obstacles and dangers that these missionaries confronted, would we have even ventured into the field? Hindsight is all very well, but pioneers do not have the benefit of hindsight, because no one's gone before them. They are the pathfinders. There was no one that William Carey could learn from. He was the first. And as I ventured into mission fields of Mozambique and Angola and Sudan, my respect for these missionaries has only increased. I was actually reading Livingstone's travels while retracing much of his steps in the Shuri Valley of Malawi and the Zambezi Valley of Mozambique in the mid-1980s, when I was doing primary research in the killing fields of Mozambique. In 1989, when I was captured by communist troops in Mozambique, flown by Russian helicopters, Soviet Mi-8 helicopters to Tet, I was intrigued to see how Livingstone's description of Tet back in the 1850s could accurately have been applied to Tet in 1989 as well. The devastations from the Arab slave traders, which he recorded in the Zambezi expedition, could also have described a lot of the scorched earth policy of the communist Frelimo government and the Soviet allies in the 1980s. Bodies floating down the river, burned out villages and all that. On other occasions, as I was going down some of the worst roads I've ever experienced in the Shisheki area of Zambia, I remembered some of the trials and tribulations of David Livingstone in that very area. And as I've regularly had to remind young volunteers in our mission, particularly the Americans, that David Livingstone had to walk where we drive. I mean, we're driving where he walked. If you think the roads are bad driving, what do you think it was like walking? And he had to walk across an Africa that had no roads, no bridges, no shops, no hospitals, neither was clean water available, no Aquila, nothing like that. As David Livingstone said, he had to, I've drunk water swarming with insects, thick with mud, putrid with rhinoceros urine and buffalo dung. Well, I don't know if any of us can say that. Hacking his way through dense jungle, walking for days in pouring rain, totally drenched, with all his equipment either rusting or rotting. If it's made of metal, it was rusting. If it was made of canvas, it was rotting. Livingstone persevered across the continent. Hostile tribes demanded exorbitant payment for crossing their territory. We complain about visa fees. Well, he had to do more than entering one country. It was every single tribal boundary. His life was often in danger from Muslim slave raiders. When you see the columns of people carrying boxes on their head, that wasn't for his luxury. They weren't carrying his bath or something. They were carrying trading items that they needed, beads and cloth, to pass each tribal chief's territory. So basically, he had a whole team just carrying the taxes they'd need to cross these different boundaries. He was mauled by a lion, even though it was his fault. He was charged by a rhino. He was laid low by fever. Over 60 occasions he suffered from fever. The afflictions which Livingstone was called to endure while opening up Africa for the gospel and opposing the slave trade tested the limits of human endurance. Leeches, maggots, putsy flies, cholera, pneumonia, sunburn, huge sores, tropical ulcers, and malaria plagued him. And that's just a short list. Yet his indomitable spirit rose as he set his heart to accomplish goals which seemed humanly impossible. He persevered, and as a result of his sacrificial labors, the slave trade in Central and Eastern Africa was exposed and eradicated. And yet, when I went to GCAWI, Global Consultation World Evangelism, 1997 in Pretoria, the first part of the program was a stupid skit, brainless skit, where they ridiculed David Livingstone. This is at the beginning of a missions conference, and I thought, well, you know, the rest of us might as well go home, because if he is a failure, what hope do we have? And, you know, is this inspiring? Why do these idiots do it? And I've seen it my whole life. As a Christian, missions conferences ridiculing or criticizing the missionaries of the past. Normally some arrogant speaker, you know, speaking disparagingly of the missionaries of the past, as though he would have gone or done a better job. Livingstone's steadfast example was used by the Lord to inspire many hundreds of men and women to devote their lives to African missions, such as Mary Slessor, who went to Calabar. And by the way, Mary Slessor was even more poverty-stricken and disadvantaged than David Livingstone. And Dr. Kenneth Fraser, who was inspired to go to Moorland in South Sudan, where we've been under fire, and the Moro people have been in the very forefront of the battle for faith and freedom, where the Sudan government has been burning the villages, bombing their churches, and many of these churches, like the birthplace of Christianity in South Sudan, bombed. You would have thought these people would not be able to survive this, and yet they did, their faith intact. Kenneth Fraser did such a good job. He planted the first schools, the first churches, the first hospitals, and by God's grace, they're still going to this day. And the Moro people, the most literate, well-educated people in South Sudan, as a direct result of Dr. Kenneth Fraser's missionary work, which was inspired by David Livingstone. And these people like Pastor Jeffrey and Pastor Vasco, some of the fruit of their great-grandfathers were converted by Kenneth Fraser. Here's a group of pastors who came for a Muslim evangelism workshop that I was going to run, standing in the ashes of the church that had been destroyed by helicopter gunships of the Arabs just the week before, but they still wanted me to teach them how to evangelize their enemies. And here, rebuilding the church that was destroyed by the Arabs' air attack, the pastors in Moorland receiving Bibles, hymn books, Sunday school books, church conference in the forest. The church is burned down. They're meeting in the forest in order to be protected from aerial bombardments. And that was the first conference I spoke at in South Sudan. My father-in-law, Bill Bathman, 67 years in the mission field. When he was age 70, he took him to Sudan. He was ministering to the people there, here, teacher training. This is Easter Sunday in Moorland at Louis Cathedral. The church has been bombed 10 times. Under La Roe, the slave traders' tree where the Arabs used to tether up the Moro people to send them up the Nile to Khartoum. Under that tree, Kenneth Fraser began the first church and Sunday school. The Bible in the Moro language, we had the privilege of getting this printed in Singapore. And we took in the first 10,000 copies of the Bible in the Moro language. And it was a phenomenal privilege to be part of the link of the generations that had worked hard. The Bible, which Kenneth Fraser translated the Gospels and Acts into Moro, and then Canon Israel Loriri did the rest of the Old Testament, New Testament, and then we had the privilege of getting it printed. And on the road to Juba, Canon Israel Awiri was ambushed and killed on the way to getting the Bible printed. And it was our privilege to get the manuscripts ultimately printed and to bring them in. Well, as I was doing an evangelism explosion training program with the people in Jumba, we were bombed on a Sunday morning. We were training people in evangelism, going hut to hut, door to door, and first evangelism, and then on the Sunday, as I was saying, if you were to die today, do you know for sure if you're going to heaven? The cry went out, Antonovs, and everyone fled out the church, and we were bombed. As I put my head out from under the thatch, because there wasn't exactly a doorway, but the thatch insulates you from the noise. And I heard nothing until I put my head out from under. I could hear the screams of the bombs, and it was so intense, I knew there was no time to take a step to get to the bomb shelters, to look up, to see where the bombs were. I just had to lie flat. I took this picture while lying flat on the ground with the aftermath of 5 1,000-kilogram bombs exploding. And here's some of the shrapnel that landed around us. A piece of bark from this tree over here must have hit me in the side because I felt this horrible kick in my left side, and I thought, yeah, I must be dead. Because initially you don't feel pain. There's always this numbness initially. And as I brushed away the dust, I couldn't see any blood, and it must have been a piece of tree bark that hit me that cracked my ribs, not any metal, because if it was metal, it would have kept going. Well, after the bombing, the church service continued for another 5 hours. How many churches do you know would continue a service after being bombed? And we didn't lose anyone. In fact, we gained people. There were more people in the church after bombing than there were before. And the highlight was presenting them the Bible, the first complete Bible in the Moro language, which you'll see in the glass cabinet in the reception downstairs. And I remembered at that time to tell him, do you know, some people hate the Bible so much they're willing to kill to stop it. Others love the Word of God so much they're willing to die to advance it. And not only did Canon Israel Awiri die, and he's buried not far from where we were, to get this Bible translated and printed. But William Tyndale, the man who translated the Bible into English, had to do it in Germany and had to smuggle these Bibles printed in Germany into England because the Bible in English was illegal in England. And most of the first 5,000 copies of the English New Testament were burned on order of the Bishop of London at St. Paul's, mind you. And so I was able to point out to them that what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but if he loses his own soul? The Word of God is so important. And we had people gathering from far and wide. Here's some of the soldiers who came to see the church that was bombed but which still stood. And we completed our evangelism explosion training program the next week. And the people continued to end, even though there was every expectation the Arabs might come back and bomb us again. Here's one of the trees that was blown over in the bombing. The trees were filled with shrapnel, but the people were not. We had 300 people at church that day. They dropped 8 1,000-kilogram bombs, all landed within 100 meters of church. That's an area the size of a football field. So imagine 8,000 kilograms of bombs dropped in an area the size of a football field and not one person killed. Not even anyone seriously injured. I think the only injury was me with a few cracked ribs. And one of the commanders came and said, this happened to show the power of God. The Bibles of the Christians are more powerful than the bombs of the Muslims. And so the Word of God is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. Jesus Christ said in Matthew 16:18, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, modern detractors of the 19th century missionary movement like to brush aside the historical realities which the missionaries had to confront. They prefer to paint Africa before the influence of the gospel as idyllic and utopian. For example, Kenneth Kaunda, one-time dictator of Zambia, wrote in his book, A Humanist in Africa, the people of Africa knew nothing about suffering until the missionaries arrived. In other words, the gospel is the problem. Kenneth Kaunda, by the way, said he couldn't agree with his parents who were Calvinists. He says, I don't believe in the sinfulness of man, I believe in the goodness of man. I'm a humanist, not a Christian. Well, Zambia has been one of our mission fields. First time I went to Zambia, I was arrested for not paying a bribe and ended up in the Salka Central Prison, cell 11, and with presidential detainees. And I had the opportunity of preaching the gospel to these over 1,200 prisoners every day in a prison that the British had built for 80 prisoners. And when Kenneth Kaunda was locked up there for 8 months, the British gave him a room to himself. But when we were locked up under Kenneth Kaunda, a humanist who believed in the goodness of man, there were 60 to 65 people crammed into a cell. And it didn't look this good at that stage, the Salka Central Prison. We were crammed in a cell 25 feet by 15 feet. We were crammed 60-odd people in a cell. So Kenneth Kaunda believed in the goodness of man. According to people like Kaunda, all Africans lived in peace, harmony, tranquility, prosperity before the missionaries arrived with the gospel and ruined everything. Now you might expect such ahistoric ramblings from committed Marxists like Hitler Hunsrück, this man who led Mugabe's farm invasions. But incredibly, all too many Christians, because of their ignorance of history, repeat these allegations even in Christian publications and missions conferences. But the reality of heathenism is different. When Mary Slessor arrived in Calabar, she was horrified to discover a woman who gave birth to twins was regarded with horror. The belief was that the father of one of the twins must be an evil spirit. The mother had been guilty of a great sin to bear twins. She must have had sexual relations with some demon or some spirit. And so at least one of the children was believed to be a monster. Twins were seized, their backs were broken, they were crushed into a calabash or a water pot. They were taken out, not by the doorway, but by a hole broken in the back wall, which was immediately built up again. And the babies were thrown in the bush where they were left to be eaten by insects and wild beasts. And Mary found Calabar in a grip of rampant witchcraft, drunkenness, immorality. And she intervened to prevent a witch doctor pouring boiling oil over a woman who was spread-eagled on the ground. She physically intervened, stood in front of the witch doctor and prevented him from scalding this poor innocent woman. Cannibalism and slavery between the tribes was widespread. Once when she was instructed to heal a dying chief, Mary knew if she failed, she'd be blamed for the death. And this often would happen. Witch doctors carry on and on until they've extracted all the riches that this person's got. And when the sick person is about to die, they call in the missionary so that the missionary can get the blame for when the person finally dies. But Mary Slessor first got rid of all the witchcraft charms, the sacrificed chickens lying around. Then she prayed and she gave the chief good medicine. She nursed him back to health, and he survived. And the wives of the chiefs were particularly grateful for Mary's success. They would have been killed with the chief and buried with the chief if he had died. So these wives were understandably keen to learn about the book. When Samuel Marsden, the pioneer missionary to New Zealand, witnessed the depth of degradation, the hold of superstition over the Maori people. When people say the Maoris are the original inhabitants of New Zealand, that's not true. The Maori ate the original inhabitants of New Zealand. And the widow of the deceased chief hanged herself with the approval and the applause of her parents and brothers. Can you imagine a relative applauding someone committing suicide? That's how depraved the Maori were. Cannibalism was rife amongst the Maori. One chief declared he had eaten 139 people. Now, he couldn't count, but he kept one bone from every person he'd ever killed and had the pile there and challenged Samuel to count up to see how many humans he had eaten. One woman confessed she had killed and eaten 19 children. Missionaries to the New Hebrides found human sacrifice, cannibalism, prevalent throughout the Pacific. In Fiji, 2/3 of all the children were boiled and eaten. Every village had a human butcher. Aged parents were butchered and eaten by their children. Men would even cook their best wife or child as a special feast for their friends. John Peyton, the missionary to the New Hebrides, reported on an occasion on Tana, where 3 women were killed in a human sacrifice to secure the recovery to health of the chief. That's a reality of heathenism before the gospel got there. When missionary to the South Sea Islands, John Williams, was criticized for imposing foreign Christian standards upon unwilling communities living in primitive bliss. John Williams noted, these were the same communities and societies where laziness and promiscuity and human sacrifice and the burial alive of infants had shortly before been commonplace. John Williams, by the way, was cooked and eaten on the island of Erromonga within minutes of landing. Far from the missionaries interrupting the peace and the tranquility of pagan nations, the missionaries came to nations who were passing through immense upheavals. When Hudson Taylor first landed in Shanghai, 1854, the country was being torn apart by a vicious civil war, the so-called Taiping Rebellion. Rebels held the city. 50,000 imperial troops besieged it. The house that Hudson Taylor was staying in Shanghai was struck by cannon fire, and the house next to his was destroyed while he was doing his language study. That's a little distracting, don't you think? He frequently witnessed people being beheaded. He himself came close to being lynched on occasion. Over 25 million Chinese were killed in two civil wars that waged between 1850s and the 1860s in China. Another 10 million Chinese died between 1877 and 1879 during a famine, one famine in the north of China. So as Dr. George Grant states in his introduction to the Greater Century of Missions, as missionaries moved out from Christendom to the utmost parts of the earth, they were shocked to discover all the horrors of untamed paganism. They found abortion all too prevalent, infanticide all too commonplace, abandonment all too familiar, euthanasia all too customary. They were confronted by the specters of endemic poverty, reoccurring famine, unfettered disease, widespread chattel slavery, cannibalism, ritual abuse, patricide, that's the killing of parents, human sacrifice, sexual perversity, petty tyranny, paternalistic exploitation, live burials, exterminative clan warfare, genocidal tribal vendettas, all this predominated. As missionaries circled the globe, penetrated the jungles and crossed the seas, they preached a singular message: light out of darkness, liberty out of tyranny, life out of death. To cultures endemic with terrible poverty, brutality, lawlessness, and disease, those faithful Christian witnesses injected the novel Christian concepts of grace, charity, law, medicine, the sanctity of life. They overturned despots. They liberated the captives. They rescued the perishing. They established hospitals. They founded orphanages. They started rescue missions. They built almshouses, that's homes for the poor. They opened soup kitchens. They incorporated charitable societies. They changed laws. They demonstrated love. They lived as if people really mattered. Wherever missionaries went, they faced a dual challenge: confront sin in men's hearts, confront sin in men's cultures. And the obstacles and the dangers and the difficulties that these missionaries had to face and overcome were staggering. By an act of British Parliament, all missionaries to India were illegal. In China, not only was all missionary activity completely illegal, it was also illegal to attempt to learn the Chinese language, like a death penalty offense. There was a ban on any Chinese teaching their language to foreigners. And so the Chinese tutors to Robert Morrison, who was the first Protestant missionary to China, carried poison on their bodies so that if they were discovered, they could end their lives quickly and escape torture. Because at that time the Chinese forbade foreign women, Robert Morrison had to live apart from his wife Mary for most of their lives. Once they were separated for 6 years. I mean, I know wives who complain if their husband's away for 6 days. America's first foreign missionary, Adoniram Judson, was captured on the high seas, incarcerated in a French prison from which he escaped, and they should make a film on this man. Later he is imprisoned and tortured in death prison in Burma for 18 months, where they hung their feet, pulled their feet up way above, so that only the shoulders were on the ground at night. I mean, imagine a backache. You sometimes get out of your bed and you feel you've got some stiff back. Can you imagine these poor guys? He couldn't even walk when his wife first saw him because of the conditions they had to sleep under. David Livingstone wrote to his sisters, "We need to be uncommon Christians. That is, eminently holy, devoted servants of the Most High. Let us seek that selfishness be extirpated, pride banished, unbelief driven from the mind, every idol dethroned, everything hostile to holiness, everything opposed to divine will, crucified, that holiness to the Lord may be engraved on the heart and evermore characterize the whole conduct." Can you imagine getting a letter like that from an elder brother. A mission organization wrote to David Livingstone asking, "Have you found a good road to where you are? If so, we want to send other men to join you." Livingstone characteristically responded, "If you have men who will come only if they know there's a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come even if there's no road at all." C.T. Studd, the famous cricket captain turned pioneer missionary, declared, "If Jesus Christ be God, and if he died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him." This from the sports superstar of his age. As he suffered malaria and other attacks, C.T. Studd wrote, "Some like to live within sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell." In the words of C.T. Studd, Christ's call is to capture men from the devil's clutches, to snatch them from the very jaws of hell, to enlist and train them for Jesus, make them a mighty army of God. But this can only be accomplished by red-hot, unconventional, unfettered, Holy Spirit religion, by reckless sacrifice, by heroism in the foremost trenches. And the challenge of David Livingstone rings out just today. Can that be called a sacrifice, which is simply paid back as a small part of a great debt owing to our God, which we can never repay? It is emphatically no sacrifice. Say rather, it is a privilege. So studying the sacrifices and the exploits of the pioneer missionaries of the 19th century is most challenging and inspiring. I enjoyed producing this book more than any other. These were ordinary people, actually, but they were made extraordinary by a dynamic, vibrant Christian faith, which carried them through some of the worst circumstances imaginable. C.T. Studd testified, "I once had another religion, hunting the Bible for hidden truths, but no obedience, no sacrifice. Then came the change. The real thing came before me. Words became deeds. The commands of Christ became not merely Sunday recitations, but battle calls to be obeyed. Assent to creed was born again into decisive action of obedience." Hudson Taylor stated his life was based upon three facts. There is a living God. He has spoken in the Bible. He means what he says, and he will do all that he has promised. Hudson Taylor wrote of the intense longing for God that gripped him. The conviction never left him that he was called to China. Hudson Taylor agonized in prayer for China, sometimes praying through the night. He wrote of wrestling with his unbelief and how the Lord conquered my unbelief, and I surrendered myself to God for this service. As Hudson Taylor said, the Great Commission is not an option to be considered, it is a command to be obeyed. And George Verver, by the way, put it even stronger. He said, you don't need a call to go in the mission field. You've already got a command and a commission. You need a call to stay away from the mission field, to be excused. At the end of his long life, Hudson Taylor could declare the sun had never risen upon him in China without finding him at prayer. I mean, that's an amazing commitment, perseverance. The battle is the Lord's, and he will conquer. We may fail. We do fail continually, but he never fails. The pioneer missionaries of the 19th century were inspired by a most positive and optimistic faith. They were absolutely convinced that the Lord who gave the Great Commission would ensure that the Great Commission would be fulfilled. The will of God will never lead you where the grace of God cannot keep you. That's from Hudson Taylor. When, after 7 years of laboring in China, Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, saw the first Chinese convert, he wrote, "May he be the first fruits of a great harvest, one of millions who will believe and be saved." Scotland's first foreign missionary, Alexander Duff, declared, "Oh, what promises are ours, if we only had faith to grasp them. What a promise is that in the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. And lo, I'm with you, even to the end of the world." We go forth amongst the hundreds of millions of the nations. We find gigantic systems of idolatry and superstition consolidated for thousands of years. They tower as high mountains. But what does faith say? Believe, and it shall be. And if any church on earth will realize that faith, to that church will honor belong, of evangelizing the nations and bring low the mountains. When after 7 years labor in India, William Carey was able to witness the conversion of his first convert, Krishna Pal, from Hinduism, Carey declared, the divine grace which changed one Indian's heart could obviously change 100,000. So you would have thought he might have been discouraged, but he was encouraged. Carey declared, the work to which God has set his hands will infallibly prosper. We only want men and money to fill this country with the knowledge of Christ. We are neither working at uncertainty, nor are we afraid for the results. Christ must reign until Satan has not 1 inch of territory. God's cause will triumph. In the words of William Carey's historic sermon, which launched the modern missionary movement, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. God is great, honor him with great faith. And by God's grace, Carey was able to successfully campaign against the Hindu practice of sati, where widows were burned alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands. And Carey also ended the practice of burning lepers alive to ensure a better reincarnation. Carey established the first newspaper ever printed in the Oriental language. He introduced the steam engine to India. He pioneered lending libraries. He introduced savings banks. He pioneered forestry conservation. He established the first Christian college in Asia, which is still training leaders. And he succeeded in producing and distributing over 200,000 Bibles, New Testaments, or Gospels, in 36 languages, the greatest translator in history, in addition to many books and tracts. By God's grace, through the ministry of Mary Slessor, the killing of twins ceased. Slave trading in Calabar was eradicated. Drunkenness, killing, witchcraft diminished. Many schools and churches were established. Most of the people of Calabar came to embrace the gospel of Christ. The first public Christian worship service in New Zealand was conducted Christmas Day, 1814, by Samuel Marsden. By 1845, it was reported 98% of Maoris had embraced Christianity. By the time John Williams was clubbed to death and eaten by cannibals on the island of Erromonga, 1839, he had already succeeded in transforming scores of islands by the scriptures he had translated, the schools he had established, the churches he had built. Many thousands of islanders had come to salvation in Christ, and these had been cannibals. John Williams had been converted 25 years before by a sermon based on, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world, but if he loses his own soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Well, true to that verse, which he heard that night of his conversion in 1814, John Williams found his life by losing it for Christ. By the way, the same day and place where John Williams was commissioned and sent out by the London Missionary Society, so was Robert Moffat. Robert Moffat came to South Africa, and John Williams went to the Pacific Islands. Frank Patton followed in his father John Patton's footsteps. He became a missionary to the island of which his father had been forced to flee from 34 years before, the island of Tanna. During his ministry there, Frank was blessed to see the whole population of Tanna won for Christ. They actually had a memorial there that said, before Frank Patton came, there were no Christians. When he left, there were no heathen. I mean, isn't that an amazing testimony? In the same way, Robert Morrison had the joy of seeing his son, John Morrison, follow in his footsteps, pour his heart and soul into the work of bringing the gospel to the people of China. Adoniram Judson had 10 children, 5 of whom died in the field. But of his 5 surviving children, they all grew up to distinguish themselves in Christian service. Robert Moffat, who produced the first complete translation of the Bible into an African language, the Tswana language, he had the joy of seeing 5 of his 7 children actively involved in missionary service. And what his daughter Mary ended up being the wife of David Livingstone. His son John Moffat established the first mission station amongst the Matabele, where I grew up in Bulawayo in Rhodesia. 2 of C.T. Studd's daughters, who had been born in China, came out and joined him with their husbands in his Heart of Africa mission in the Congo, what later became known as WEC, Worldwide Evangelization for Christ. So, the spectacular achievements of God-fearing Christians in confronting cannibalism and child sacrifice and widow burning and slavery, this needs to be understood. The missionaries of the 19th century steadfastly resisted the Islamic slave trade. They set tens of thousands of captives free. We need to make these eye-opening exposés of what Africa, the Middle East, and Asia were really like before the advent of the gospel. We need to make them known. And how much we are all indebted to the sacrificial services of these dedicated disciples who laid down their lives, laying solid foundations for the future. When pioneer missionary to Persia, Henry Martyn, sought to present his Persian New Testament to the Shah, he was challenged with an ultimatum: declare that Muhammad is the prophet of God, or we'll rip out your tongue for blasphemy. And Henry Martyn boldly refused, and he asserted Jesus Christ is the Son of God. His opponents were enraged. They threatened to have his tongue torn out for blasphemy. When Robert Moffat first applied to the London Missionary Society, he was rejected. His proposal to marry Mary Smith was also refused by her parents. Yet Robert persevered, and on his first missionary expedition to South Africa, he succeeded in bringing to Christ the most notorious bandit and murderer in the country. And finally, Mary Smith's parents relented and gave permission, and she sailed to South Africa where they married. And for the next 50 years, the Moffats became one of the greatest husband-wife teams in missionary history. Robert Moffat succeeded in being the first to translate the complete Bible into an African language, which was Tswana. And when Britain was the greatest economic, military power in the world, Queen Victoria was asked by a visiting African prince, what is the secret of Britain's greatness? She presented him with the Bible and said, here is the secret of Britain's greatness. That's also the secret of why Britain is no longer great. They've abandoned the Bible. Samuel Zwina chose to oppose Islam. He resolved to engage the enemy on the soil of Arabia, the birthplace of Muhammad. And one of the many fruits of William Wilberforce's lifelong crusade against the slave trade was that Samuel Ajay Crowther, who was born in Yorubaland in 1807, the year Great Britain abolished the slave trade, he became the first African bishop of the Church of England. So Samuel Crowther was born in Yorubaland, and at age 13, he was captured by African slave traders, sold to a Portuguese trader on the coast who transported him across the Atlantic. But Samuel was rescued by a British naval squadron in 1822, put ashore at Freetown. And from 1809, the British government mobilized its navy to search suspected slave ships, even foreign vessels on the high seas. For a century, the Royal Navy was dedicated to setting the captives free, going far beyond clearing the oceans of slave ships. We helped in the production of this book, Royal Navy versus the Slave Traders, by Bernard Edwards some years ago. They boldly sailed up uncharted rivers and creeks, stormed slave stockades, freeing captives at every turn. And here's just one photograph of a group of slaves rescued by the university's mission and the Royal Navy back in 1893. Great Britain dedicated its resources to fighting and opposing the slave trade. And the British spent millions of pounds in suppressing the slave trade. They sacrificed a lot of blood in fighting to set the captives free. And the West African country of Sierra Leone was established by British evangelicals like William Wilberforce to serve as a haven for freed slaves, hence the capital called Freetown. And you can see the coins even produced. Sierra Leone Company, William Wilberforce's face on the other side of the coins. In Sierra Leone, Samuel Crowther was converted to Christ. He received an education both in Sierra Leone and in England. And about the third year of my liberation from the slavery of men, I was convinced of another worse state of slavery, that of sin and Satan. I was admitted into the visible church of Christ here on earth as a soldier to fight manfully under his banner against spiritual enemies. And in 1843, Samuel was ordained as a Church of England minister for service with the Church Missionary Society. And Crowther was one of the leaders of a successful missionary venture that took him and several former slaves back to Yorubaland, where vigorous Christianity soon developed and is still strong there today. One of the first converts Samuel was able to baptize was his own mother, and she took the Christian name Hannah. So Hannah received her son from the Lord and gave the son back to the Lord. His language, Yoruba, became the first African language to be used for Church of England liturgy and worship, prayer book being translated into Yoruba. So the Yoruba Christian worship was distinctly Protestant and evangelical in the Church of England style. And Crowther led his converts in burying or destroying their traditional charms, fetishes, witchcraft idols. In 1864, Crowther was ordained as the first African bishop of the Church of England in an overflowing Canterbury Cathedral, with much rejoicing. He was directed to undertake a mission along the Niger River, which was to follow up on the Niger expedition of 1841, which was led by William Wilberforce's successor, Foxwell Buxton. T. Foxwell Buxton was the evangelical leader in Parliament. He is the anti-slavery crusader after William Wilberforce. This expedition up the Niger River Valley of West Africa was to overcome the ravages of the slave trade, which was entrenched there. Of 145 Europeans on this expedition, 130 were struck down with malaria and 40 died. One trip, can you imagine? Yet the expedition succeeded in establishing a missionary center at Fora Bay for training liberated slaves to evangelize West Africa. They built the university on the very place where a slave market had once stood. The rafters of the roof were made almost entirely from the masts of old slave ships donated by the Royal Navy for this purpose. Samuel Crowther was one of the first 4 students to graduate from Fora Bay College, the first university in sub-Saharan Africa. Samuel labored diligently to bring the gospel to the different tribes on the Niger River. He produced biblical tracts and scripture texts dealing with witchcraft and charms. And when I visited his house, the curator was showing me the New Testament that he translated. He also dealt with the common ground between the Quran and the scriptures, producing gospel presentations for Muslims founded entirely on biblical quotations. Crowther wrote in 1854 of his contact with the king of the Punda, I asked if he would like his people to be taught God's book and how to worship God as we do in the white man's country. For it is these 2 things together which made England great, and they would bring peace and prosperity to any country who received and embraced them. The king replied that he was very desirous that war should cease, that his people might trade and be taught God's book. He wished us many blessings. And so Crowther was effective in opposing slavery, witchcraft, and Islam, and he won many converts amongst the Nupe and the Hausa tribes. And he created such an effective evangelical Anglicanism that was truly African. Today there's over 18 million Anglicans in Nigeria. That's 18 times more Anglicans in church on Sunday in Nigeria than all the British Isles, Canada, and North America combined. Missions is the lifeblood of the church. It's absolutely essential that our congregations and our families be present with these and many other blessings, these examples of how God has blessed in such extraordinary ways. We need to read these examples, feed our minds and souls with examples of excellence. So I pray these few selected adventures, these sacrifices and exploits, these pictures, these achievements, will whet your appetite to read the Greatest Century of Missions book and to obtain more missionary biographies. We need to start the lifelong habit of making time to feed our mind and soul with what Alexander Somerville called the noblest object that can engage the enthusiasm of man, the salvation of millions. So may God be pleased to use the Greatest Century of Missions to inspire a new generation of missionaries to expect great things from God and to attempt great things for God. One of those who answered the call was David Brainerd. His journal included this prayer: here I am, send me to the rough, to the savage pagans of the wilderness. Send me from all that is called comfort on earth. Send me even to death itself, if it be but in thy service and to promote thy kingdom. You only have one life, it will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. So that is a chapter in the Greatest Century of Missions, summarizing the other chapters too.